Please, he's hurting my mama. The text glowed on Graham Whitlock's phone as thunder roared outside. He didn't know the number or the child, but something deep in him snapped awake. Now, racing through a Colorado storm, headlights slicing through rain, he followed the GPS to a rundown apartment. The crying in the distance grew louder. When he saw the shattered window and a tiny shadow screaming for help, he realized this wasn't a mistake. That message had found him for a reason. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. On the quiet edges of Boulder, Colorado, the evening had fallen heavy and still. The small apartment complex Naomi Harris called home sat wedged between a pawn shop and an old laundromat, both long past their better days. Inside, Naomi sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unopened bills. Her fingers traced the edge of a power notice, the kind printed in red letters. She'd been juggling 2 part-time jobs since before Christmas, cleaning offices by day, stocking shelves by night, and still, it was never enough. Her daughter, Aria, 8 years old and far too perceptive for her age, sat on the floor nearby coloring in silence. She was bright and sweet, the kind of child who still believed the world could be kind, even when it hadn't been to her mama. But tonight, Naomi's chest felt tight. She'd gotten a text an hour ago, from him. Daryl, her ex-boyfriend. The man she tried to leave behind more than once. He wasn't Aria's father, but he had been in their lives long enough to leave scars neither of them could talk about. He'd been drinking again. His messages were angry, full of threats. She thought she'd blocked his number, but he always found new ones. Naomi checked the door twice, made sure it was locked, then told Aria to grab her things. "We're gonna stay with Grandma tomorrow," she murmured, trying to sound calm. But Aria heard the quiver in her mother's voice. A knock came, heavy, sharp, impatient. Naomi froze. The knock came again, louder this time. And then his voice. "Naomi, open the door." Aria's eyes widened. "Mama." Naomi pulled her daughter close. "Go," she whispered, pointing toward the bedroom closet. "Hide, baby. Don't make a sound." Aria ran, clutching her phone in trembling hands. She crawled inside the dark space, surrounded by her mother's old winter coats. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the shouts coming from the living room. She opened her phone, found Grandma's name in her contacts, and began typing fast. "Grandma, please come, he's beating my mama." But her small fingers slipped, the name auto-corrected, and she hit send before realizing the message had gone to a stranger. 20 minutes away, high above the city in a glass-walled mountain estate, Graham Whitlock was staring at his phone, lost in another empty night. He was 42, founder of a major tech company, and by most people's standards, untouchably successful. But behind the wealth was a hollow man, one who hadn't let anyone close since the night his wife died 3 years ago in a car crash he blamed himself for. His phone buzzed once, a message lighting up the screen. A known number. He almost ignored it. But the words froze him in place. "He's beating my mama. Please come." At first, he thought it was some kind of sick prank. Then another message came through, a crying emoji, a blurred photo of a small hand gripping a blanket. Something cracked inside him. Without thinking, he called 911 and forwarded the text. But as he spoke to the dispatcher, describing the message, the operator's tone stayed polite, procedural, detached. "Sir, we'll send a unit to check it out." That wasn't good enough. He traced the location through his messaging app, a small apartment near downtown Boulder. Before he even realized it, he'd thrown on his coat, grabbed his keys, and was halfway down the long private driveway of his estate. For the first time in years, his heart wasn't thinking about business or loss. It was pure instinct: protect the child, protect her mother. The drive was brutal. Rain hammered the windshield as thunder rolled across the sky. Every red light felt like a lifetime. By the time he reached the address, he saw the flicker of movement through a broken window, and the faint sound of a child crying. That's when the hook from the beginning tied in. The headlights, the screaming, the pounding of his heart. And somewhere, in that storm-soaked street, 2 completely different lives were about to collide. a desperate mother fighting for survival and a lonely billionaire searching for redemption. If stories like this remind you that kindness still matters, that sometimes one person's choice to care can change everything, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe. Because in a world full of noise, stories like these are what remind us of what being human still means. By the time Graham reached the apartment complex, the storm had become a wall of noise. The parking lot was nearly empty, puddles glimmering beneath the flickering streetlights. He spotted the unit, apartment 2B, where one window had been smashed from the inside. He stepped out of the car, heart thudding in his throat. The air smelled like rain and fear. For a man who hadn't felt adrenaline since his wife's death, the surge coursing through him now felt both foreign and alive. Inside the building, he could hear shouting. A man's voice, angry, slurred, breaking through the thin walls. Then a crash. Then a scream. Graham didn't think, he moved. He reached the door and pounded on it once. No response. Another crash. He backed up, braced himself, and kicked the door hard enough that it flew open. The living room was chaos. A coffee table overturned. Glass scattered across the floor. A woman, Tommy, crouched in the corner, shielding herself with her arm. And standing over her was a man, red-faced and drunk, holding a bottle like a weapon. For a split second, everyone froze. The man turned, eyes wild. "Who the hell are you?" But Graham didn't wait. He stepped forward, grabbed the man's arm mid-swing and twisted. The bottle fell, shattering at their feet. The two struggled, slipping on the wet tile, the sound of rain mixing with curses. It wasn't heroism that drove him, it was instinct. The same instinct that once made him pull a stranger from a car wreck years ago. The same instinct that had failed him the night his wife died. And maybe, deep down, he was trying to rewrite that moment. The man staggered back, hit the counter, and fell hard. Graham kicked the bottle shards away, then turned to Naomi. She was shaking, her lip bleeding, eyes wide in disbelief. He said nothing, just gestured toward the hallway. She understood immediately. "Arya," she whispered. They ran into the small bedroom where Arya was still hiding in the closet, her tiny fingers clutching the phone she'd used to call for help. When she saw Graham, she flinched, but Naomi's voice broke the tension. "It's okay, baby. We're safe now." Graham pulled out his phone and called 911 again, this time with urgency in his voice that even the dispatcher couldn't ignore. Police arrived minutes later, and the man, Thurl, was dragged out, cursing and shouting as they cuffed him in the rain. Inside, silence settled like dust. Naomi sat on the couch, arms wrapped around her daughter. Her shoulders trembled, but she held herself tall, proud even in her exhaustion. Arya clung to her side, eyes wide and tear-streaked. For the first time since he arrived, Graham really saw them. A mother and a child. Alone, terrified, but still standing. And for some reason he couldn't explain, it broke him a little. When the police were done taking statements, one of the officers asked Naomi if she had someone she could call, somewhere to stay. She hesitated. "My mom's in a nursing home in Denver," she said quietly. "It's just us here." The officer gave her a sympathetic nod and left her with a pamphlet about victims' aid. Graham lingered by the door, unsure if he should leave. But when Arya looked up and whispered, "Thank you, mister," that was it. He couldn't just walk away. The storm had eased by the time they stepped outside. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine. Graham offered them a ride to a nearby motel. Naomi refused at first, pride tightening her voice, but one look at Arya, shivering in her thin pajamas, and she agreed. In the car, the silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. The headlights washed over slick roads as the city lights faded behind them. Naomi held her daughter close, whispering soft words meant to soothe. Graham stole glances at them now and then, wondering how a simple text had pulled him into something that already felt deeply personal. When they reached the motel, he paid for a week's stay without a second thought. Naomi tried to protest, but he simply said, "It's just a room. No strings." Before he left, Arya tugged at his sleeve. "You came," she said, voice small but full of something pure. "You really came." That night, back in his empty mansion overlooking the storm-washed city, Graham couldn't sleep. He kept replaying those words, "You came." He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them. What Graham didn't know was that this wouldn't be the last time he saw Naomi and Arya. Because by the next morning his name and the mysterious rescue would be all over the Colorado news. And the past he'd tried to bury would soon come knocking. By morning, the rain had cleared over Colorado Springs, leaving the streets slick and quiet. But while the city stretched awake, something else stirred, a story spreading faster than the sunrise. News outlets had caught it. Unknown billionaire saves mother and child after domestic violence text. It was everywhere, on local radio, TV, social media. The security footage from the apartment complex, leaked by a bystander, showed a tall man kicking down a door and pulling a woman and child to safety. His face wasn't clear, but the luxury car in the background gave away just enough. Within hours, reporters were piecing it together. Graham Whitlock, CEO of Whitlock Innovations, the reclusive tech magnate who rarely appeared in public. Graham saw it first on his tablet while sipping his morning coffee. The headline made him frown, not out of embarrassment, but because it was a story he never wanted to be in. He wasn't a hero. He hadn't saved anyone for glory. He'd just done what any decent man should have done. But the world didn't see it that way. While the media painted him as a savior, inside, he felt something shift, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of connection. He'd spent the last 6 years in near isolation after his wife's death, living inside his work, inside silence. Yet one text from a frightened child had cracked open everything he'd built to keep the world out. Meanwhile, at the small motel on the edge of town, Naomi woke to sunlight filtering through thin curtains. Her face was bruised but calm. For the first time in months, the air around her didn't feel heavy. Arya was still asleep beside her, clutching the same phone that had changed their lives. When she stepped outside, she noticed the same police officer from the night before parked nearby. He handed her a cup of coffee and an envelope with an address. "A safe house in Denver," he told her. "You'll be okay there." Naomi didn't realize that someone else had quietly arranged it, paid in full, anonymously. She only suspected when she saw the brand of car parked briefly across the street before driving off. Back in his office, Graham's assistant was trying to handle the flood of media requests, charity inquiries, and letters from women's shelters. But Graham wasn't interested in interviews. He only asked for one thing: find out if the mother and child are safe. It wasn't about closure. It was about responsibility. He'd been given a second chance to do something that mattered, and deep down, he wasn't ready to let that go. Later that week, a letter arrived at Whitlock Innovations. It was written in soft, careful handwriting. It wasn't from a lawyer or a journalist. It was from Naomi. She thanked him for his kindness. She said she didn't have much, but she was starting a new job at a diner in Denver and enrolling Arya in school. She said she didn't know why he helped her, but she wanted him to know he'd given her hope again. And at the end, she'd written something that made him pause. "You may not think you saved us, but my daughter sleeps through the night now. That's what saving looks like." For a man who'd spent half his life surrounded by numbers, reports, and silence, those words hit harder than anything he'd ever read. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his drawer. But he couldn't let it end there. Over the next few weeks, he quietly visited the diner, always sitting at the corner booth near the window. Naomi didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on keeping things together, but he watched her with quiet respect. The way she smiled when serving customers, even after exhaustion carved into her face. The way Arya ran to her after school, arms wide, laughter unbroken. It was simple, but it was human. And it reminded him what life looked like outside boardrooms and billion-dollar contracts. About halfway through that quiet observation, Graham began something new. He started a fund, the Arya Hope Foundation, to support children who text 911 or crisis numbers in emergencies. He didn't attach his name. He didn't make a statement. It wasn't for attention. It was for them. And that's when his world truly began to shift. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to care when no one else does. If stories like this remind you that there's still good left in this world, take a moment to stay connected. Because maybe, the next time someone reaches out in silence, you'll be the one who answers. Just when life seemed to calm, Graham received a call that shattered the fragile peace he'd built. Naomi and Arya had disappeared, and the police had found signs that the man he'd stopped that night had been released. When Graham got the call, it was early morning, one of those crisp Colorado days where the air feels thin and cold. His assistant's voice trembled through the speaker. Naomi and her daughter hadn't shown up for work or school. Their motel room was empty. Their belongings were gone. At first, Graham thought maybe they'd simply moved. Started over. It would have made sense. Naomi deserved a new beginning far from the shadows of her past. But something about the tone of that call, the hesitation, the quiet panic underneath, told him otherwise. He canceled his meetings, ignored every text and call that followed, and drove straight to Denver. When he reached the small diner, the manager handed him Naomi's time card. She hadn't clocked out the day before. Her purse was still in the locker room. The police were already aware, but Graham didn't wait for answers. He started making calls to security contacts, private investigators, even one or two local reporters he trusted. It didn't take long before a pattern began to emerge. The man he'd fought that night, Daryl, had been released on bail. And the last sighting of Naomi and Arya had been near the bus terminal, late the previous evening. A security guard had seen them talking to someone near the parking lot. The description matched Daryl almost perfectly. The realization hit Graham like a physical blow. He'd saved them once. And now, they were gone again, because he hadn't made sure the danger was truly over. For 2 sleepless days, Graham barely ate. He spent hours driving around Denver, checking shelters, hospitals, and police precincts. His assistant tried to convince him to rest, but he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, Arya's little hand gripping her mother's. The look of safety that had finally returned to her face. And the thought of that safety being ripped away again, it was unbearable. On the 3rd night his phone rang. It wasn't the police. It was a blocked number. A distorted voice came through, male, cold, deliberate. "You think you can take what's mine and walk away?" the voice hissed. "She's mine. Always was." The line went dead before Graham could speak. He sat frozen for a moment, the sound echoing in his mind. Then he called every contact he had, tracing the call's origin. Within an hour, his security team found a location, an abandoned cabin near Red Feather Lakes, deep in the Colorado wilderness. The drive took 3 hours. The roads were empty, the air growing colder with every mile. By the time he reached the forest, night had fallen. The cabin came into view, small, crooked, lit by a single flickering bulb in the window. He parked far enough away not to be heard and stepped out, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed to shake his ribs. There was no backup, no police sirens, just the sound of wind and distant thunder rolling across the mountains. Through the cracked window, he saw movement. Naomi, tied to a chair. Arya huddled in the corner, trembling but alive. And standing over them was Daryl, pacing like a caged animal, shouting words that blurred into madness. Graham moved quietly to the back of the cabin. He'd been calm in business meetings that involved billions of dollars, calm under pressure, calm under loss. But this was different. This was personal. He found an old axe leaning against the porch and used it to pry open the back door. The noise made Daryl spin around. For a moment, time stopped. Daryl lunged forward, furious and unhinged, but Graham met him halfway. The fight was brutal, not choreographed or elegant, just raw, desperate survival. They crashed into furniture, splintered wood, shattered glass. Naomi tried to protect Arya, whispering for her to stay low. Finally, Graham managed to knock Daryl off balance. The man fell hard, hitting the floorboards with a dull crack. For a long moment, nobody moved. The storm outside howled through the broken door. Naomi's sobs filled the silence as Graham cut through the ropes and helped her up. Arya clung to her mother's side, crying softly. Graham called the police again, and this time, he didn't leave until they arrived. Daryl was taken away in handcuffs, unconscious and bleeding, his threats reduced to meaningless noise. As the flashing lights painted the cabin red and blue, Graham stood by his car, soaked in rain and exhaustion. He had no words, just relief. Naomi walked over to him. Her voice was quiet, trembling. There were no thanks, no speeches, just understanding. He didn't save them for the world to see. He saved them because it was right. But as dawn broke over the mountains, a new fear crept in. Graham's name was back in the headlines, this time with details the media was never meant to know. Someone had leaked the footage of the cabin. Someone close to him. And for the first time, he realized this story wasn't over, it was just beginning. The morning after the rescue, Colorado was silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean sky and the faint scent of pine in the mountain air. News vans had already swarmed the area around the cabin, their lenses capturing what they called the Billionaire's second rescue. But for Graham Whitlock, none of that mattered. He sat quietly in his car, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring out across the horizon. It wasn't pride that filled him, it was something quieter. Something heavier. The kind of feeling that settles deep in a man's chest when he realizes how fragile the line between chaos and grace can be. Inside the hospital, Naomi and Arya were recovering. Arya had a small cut on her cheek and Naomi's wrists were bruised, but both were safe. The doctors said they were lucky. Graham knew it wasn't luck. It was timing, instinct, and maybe something divine. When he finally walked into the hospital room later that morning, Naomi looked up at him with tired eyes and a soft, knowing smile. There was no fear now. No hesitation. Just gratitude, the kind that doesn't need words. He stayed for a while, sitting by the window as Arya slept, her tiny hand clutching her mother's. Naomi spoke quietly about her plans, finding a small apartment in Denver, finishing her nursing certification, giving Arya the kind of life she deserved. Graham listened, every word carving something new inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about meetings, deadlines, or markets. He was thinking about mornings like this, sunlight through hospital blinds, the sound of a child breathing softly, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to break. Over the next few weeks, things changed for all of them. Graham's company, long known for its cutting-edge technology, began shifting focus. He started investing heavily in community safety projects, shelters, and programs for women and children in crisis. Reporters called it a rebranding of conscience, but to him, it wasn't about rebranding anything. It was about redemption. He'd built empires of glass and steel, but none of it had ever meant as much as the single night a stranger's text reached his phone. Naomi and Arya moved into a small two-bedroom apartment just outside Denver. It wasn't much, a quiet neighborhood, a park nearby, but it was home. Arya started school, where she quickly became known as the girl with the brightest laugh in class. Naomi took a job at a local clinic and began studying part-time. Graham visited sometimes, always respectfully, never intruding. Sometimes he'd bring groceries or a few books for Arya. Other times he'd just sit on the porch, sharing stories about his late wife, about life, about hope. They became a quiet part of each other's worlds, not dependent, not romanticized, just connected. And maybe that was enough. Months later, one small moment summed it all up. At a fundraiser in Denver for the Arya Hope Foundation, Naomi stood behind the podium, her voice steady and calm as she shared her story. The audience listened, many in tears, as she described how one message, sent to the wrong number, had changed her entire life. At the edge of the room, Graham stood quietly watching. He wasn't there as a billionaire or a public figure. He was there as a man who'd simply decided to care. When Naomi finished her speech, she looked toward him, her eyes meeting his. No words passed between them, but the look said everything. We made it. Some stories don't start with a plan. They start with a mistake, a cry for help, or a single text sent in fear. And sometimes, those small moments, the ones we almost ignore, are the ones that change lives forever. If this story reminded you that kindness still matters, stay here with us. Because somewhere, someone might be waiting for your answer. As the night of the fundraiser came to an end, Graham stepped outside into the cool Colorado air. The city lights flickered below, and for the first time in years, his heart felt light. He thought about that first message again, the one that began with 6 trembling words, "He's beating my mama, please help." It had led to everything. And maybe, in a world full of noise, it was proof that sometimes The right heart hears the wrong message and answers anyway.